Hello there, people of the internet. So a viewer asked me to go ahead and explain why 7.62 NATO and 5.56 NATO were adopted and why they are a thing that the NATO forces are using. So there's a lot that I'm not going to cover. There's a lot of history that I'm just going to kind of breeze over. I'm going to give you guys a pretty simple, watered down version of why this is a thing, and I'm going to do that because I don't want this video to run an hour long. So let's go ahead and start off with World War II. World War II was bad, and World War I was bad. All the time periods going up to World War II was bad for the entire world, with lack of better terminology. It was definitely not good. So after World War II, a bunch of the countries that were involved in World War II kind of looked at all of the problems that they had during that war, and they decided to themselves, all right, we are all allies right now. If something like this happens again, if another war breaks out, then we need to go ahead and standardize on one set of ammunition that we're all going to produce and use, so we don't have to worry about a bunch of logistical issues. So during World War II, there was just all this variety of cartridges used by all these different forces, and there was no interchangeability with parts and parts for rifles and firearms and ammunition, and there was no compatibility with anything that came from these forces. For example, if you were in the British Army and you were fighting the Germans, and let's say you came across some Americans, well, these Americans have 30-06 and the British have 303 British, so in the event that maybe the British were running out of ammo and the Americans have a surplus of ammo, well, guess what? The British can't use that 30-06 in their 303 rifles. This right here is just a random off-the-shelf example. For the most part, it definitely came down to mass logistical issues. And there was just a ton of different cartridges being used by all these different countries. 6.5 Carcano, 7.35 Carcano, 6.5 Jap, 303 British. I know the Russians were using 7.62 by 54 rimmed, but they're not a NATO force nowadays. But hopefully you guys understand what I'm getting at. All these countries were using all these different kinds of cartridges, and there was no standardization on a cartridge to be used by all of the Allied forces, and that definitely created a lot of logistical issues. Now, on top of that, during that time period, most countries were using rifles a lot like this one right here. This is using a Vito Mauser, and it's a good representation of what was being used during that time period. Pretty much everybody was using some kind of bolt-action rifle. I know the Americans had the M1 Garand, however it is you feel like pronouncing that, but the technology of that time period was pretty much this right here. Just with how tactics of a lot of different forces were and whatnot, a lot of it's evolved around using these to protect machine guns and whatnot. I know that's what the Germans were doing. And there's a lot of different things that I can go in with how these rifles were effectively used during that time period. However, after World War II, it was discovered that an intermediate caliber cartridge was definitely going to be the wave of the future. With this intermediate caliber cartridge, there was also new styles of firearms technology being made. And we went from old school style bolt action rifles like this one right here to a more modern design such as the AR platform like this right here. It was noticed that these full power rifle rounds just were not necessary for the types of fighting that were actually taking place in warfare. So having a lighter recoiling, lighter weight, easier to carry ammunition was something that was very much noticed by the German forces and then noticed by everyone else that was having to deal with the German forces. So the United States decided to come up with 7.62 NATO. However, this was also an incredibly powerful round. I can't remember what the designation for the cartridge was before it was known as 7.62 NATO, so I think it was like T33 or T55 or T something. So some kind of cartridge, but it was designed to mimic the ballistic capabilities of the M2 ball 30-06 ammunition, which sends a 150 grain projectile at around 2,800 feet per second or so. That's a pretty hefty projectile moving pretty incredibly fast. So we have this new cartridge that was supposed to be considered an intermediate cartridge, but still had the power of a full power rifle round. And there were some countries out there who changed out their old school bolt action rifles to be able to fire this new kind of ammunition, like the Ishapur 303. I know that those are built from the ground up, they're not conversions. But these Oviedo Mausers here, these are actually converted to 7.62 Setme, but they'll handle 7.62 NATO just fine. And I have ran plenty of rounds of 7.62 NATO through this particular rifle. Let's run a couple more, shall we? Ow, that is definitely a powerful, potent round. But with the ideology of an intermediate cartridge being the wave of the future, that is definitely... Ow, this is a harsh recoiling rifle. That is definitely what these countries were starting to lean towards. So they were leaving their old school bolt action rifles for the most part. There were some countries that still kind of tried holding on to them, and they were adopting new style external magazine self-loading rifles, such as the AR platform right here. But I mean, there was like the G3 roller delayed system and the FAL system, and originally the United States adopted the M14, also chambered in 7.62 NATO. There were just the idea of the external fed self-loading rifle was becoming more predominant. However, like I said, 7.62 NATO was still a very high power round. And during this same relative time period, the United States decided to themselves, you know what, we want a lighter hitting, lighter weight round. So eventually we ended up adopting the 5.56 NATO. And during that time period, I don't think it was considered 5.56 NATO, but we convinced all of the NATO forces that were getting together wanting to standardize on one particular kind of ammunition. We convinced all of these forces to adopt both 7.62 NATO and 5.56 NATO, and we kind of like underhandedly agreed to adopt their weaponry if they adopt our cartridge, but then we kept our own weaponry, and there was like this huge controversy that came from all of that nonsense. But the United States had convinced NATO to adopt the 5.56. However, 5.56 is kind of an anemic round, and it doesn't necessarily have all of the punch for all of the things that a military force needs to do, which is one of the main reasons why 7.62 NATO is still held in regards today in NATO forces. A lot of your NATO forces are still rocking battle rifles and whatnot, but a lot of them have transitioned to the 5.56 NATO. But most of the time, whenever you're dealing with 7.62 NATO ammunition, you're going to be dealing with it out of some sort of light machine gun, some sort of anti-material machine gun, some sort of anti-infantry, like fixed position machine gun, some sort of situation like that. You're not, well, very... what's the word I'm looking for? More often than not, you're going to be dealing with people that have shoulder rifles chambered in 5.56 and machine guns and whatnot chambered into 7.62 NATO. However, there are exceptions. There are still countries out there that are using the FAL and still using the G3 PTR series and still using all sorts of different platforms that are still chambered in 7.62 NATO. So both of these cartridges are very much still being predominantly used by NATO forces. But the main reason why they were adopted was because all of these countries were looking to standardize on one particular kind of ammunition. Now, this is not 7.62 NATO, this is 223 Remington. This is just cheap tool ammo, steel case stuff that I run through this rifle for the YouTube purposes. However, that being said, this rifle right here is actually chambered for 5.56, so if I decided to run some 5.56 through this thing, it absolutely could handle that. But 5.56/223, faster follow-up shots, lighter weight ammunition, it's definitely a lesser powered ammunition than the 7.62 NATO. So in terms where you need a more powerful round that can maybe hit things at a further distance, or that can feed more adequately and do a better job through a machine gun that maybe is a anti-material or anti-vehicle machine gun. So just whenever you need a round that is more powerful than 5.56, that's the main reason. Ooh, that's nice and warm. It's a little chilly out here right now. That's one of the main reasons why NATO forces still keep around the 7.62 by 51, along with the 5.56. Now, there's also the 9mm, which has also been standardized for the same reasons, but I think that is a good, solid conclusion, a good, solid history as to why the 7.62 NATO really became a thing. Now, I do get a lot of people who come into my comments and they say that they wish that these old military surplus rifles were chambered in 7.62 NATO. Well, bear in mind that 7.62 NATO came about whenever these old military surplus rifles were obsolete. And these old military surplus rifles, the bolt-action style ones for the most part, were being used back whenever every country had their own individual cartridge. And that was just what was going on with the time period. Nowadays, we have rifles like this, and these are definitely the more practical style of rifle out there. They're more modern, more capable, and just a better choice of rifle for the modern style of combat that we are seeing going on in the world today. You definitely would not want to bring an old school bolt action rifle, but that's why your modern stuff like this right here, like the AR-10, not the AR-15, but the AR-10 style, or the G3 FAL M14, insert your choice of a 7.62 NATO rifle here. But those modern style of rifles are the ones that run 7.62 NATO, because those are the ones that came into existence whenever 7.62 NATO was being adopted. That was the next generation of the United States and NATO forces trying to adopt better weaponry on top of adopting an intermediate caliber cartridge. Now, 7.62 NATO, I still consider it a full power rifle round just because it does really mimic the military 30-06, and I definitely consider that a full power rifle round. The only difference is the 7.62 NATO is going to be a little bit shorter. I think 30-06 is 7.62 by 63, and 7.62 NATO is 7.62 by 51. So it is a shorter cartridge, but it does have more, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, due to modern manufacturing, modern capabilities, modern powder production, modern burn rates, modern XYZ thing, we were able to achieve the same capabilities as the military 30-06. That we were able to do with 7.62 NATO. So it might be smaller, but it definitely packs plenty of a punch. I would not want to get hit by it, that's for sure. Hopefully this was a fun little video for you guys to watch. I know I definitely enjoyed making it. I like bringing out these old school rifles. And I don't think I made a dedicated video specifically talking about the origins of 7.62 NATO. So now I can say that I have. So that is why 7.62 NATO and 5.56 NATO was adopted by NATO forces. They all just wanted to standardize on a cartridge in case some massive conflict happens. And they learned a lot of lessons through the Second World War. They were looking for intermediate caliber cartridges. They tried with 7.62 NATO. It was still pretty gosh darn powerful compared to what it is that they wanted. So they ended up going with 5.56 NATO. And the United States had a tremendous influence in all of that. So there's a good summary. Thanks for watching, folks. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below. Link to all sorts of stuff. Go check that out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'm going to go hydrate because, man, I'm thirsty. I will see you all on the next episode. Since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen.
a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.